again, it's Adam back with another episode of Pet Squares, the only show on YouTube that dares to ask what the Beach Boys did and why'd they do it, except for about 40 other ones. But anyway, let's proceed. Tonight we are going to be covering one of the most fascinating and, dare I say, mysterious albums in the Beach Boys catalog, their fourth long player, Little Deuce Coupe. But before we get into that, just a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, thanks for everybody that tuned in to Pet Squares 3A, the special Patreon-only episode of this series that I put up a few weeks ago to deal with some of the outside productions and performances of the Beach Boys in the 1962-1963 period. Now, about 200 people tuned in to see the first part of that, which was up on YouTube, and then the remaining part was basically set up so only patrons could watch it. I didn't mean to make it that difficult to watch, and then I realized later that Patreon and PayPal, the two ways you can contribute and subscribe to this show, they both sort of nudge you into the $5 and $10 range. And look, all you people that are contributing at that level, you are helping me a great deal, so thank you. But I didn't want to make it that difficult to see the bonus episode, which was a lot of fun to do, by the way. So I did set up a new tier on Patreon, actually two new tiers. I'm broke but want to help a little, which is $1.62 a month. And I can swing more than $1, which is $3.23 per month. So Patreon and PayPal both let you set any amount that you want. You don't have to pay $5 a month or $10 a month to see the bonus episodes. One of these is fine. Just look in the first comment or in the info box for information on how to do that. Second of all, the music part of my media empire, Karma Frog Records. We've got a Bandcamp page up now, and I'm telling you this because there's a really cool release coming up next month. You probably have heard of a guy named Steve Kalinich. He's a poet, and he is the only person to have co-written songs with Brian, Dennis, and Carl Wilson, and now me, because we have collaborated on a long-form poem. It's not just me noodling in the background going, hey man, it's a totally scored experience. So if you're into the weirder stuff that the Beach Boys did, like the Smile stuff, or maybe some of those psychedelic soundtracks from 70s cartoons they used to have, that's kind of the sound of it. So if you get on the Bandcamp page, we'll let you know when that's coming out. So the Bandcamp page is karmafrog.bandcamp.com. So the last bit of business to take care of, you might remember there was a great accordion debate dating back to Pet Sounds 2, where some of the folks that are researching the Beach Boys history found an accordion buried deep in the track for the song Lana on the Surfing USA album. We had a little bit of a debate back and forth, healthy debate. And we finally agreed to disagree because I thought this instrument was a toy accordion. They thought it was Brian's childhood accordion. We have now discovered that Brian's childhood accordion was a toy accordion, so we were both right. Isn't science wonderful? So let's get started. Little Deuce Coupe. This is a really interesting record. It was one I wasn't all that familiar with, and it's got a very peculiar history. I'm going to do a little more rundown overview of the album than I usually do before we get into the song by song, and you'll see why when we get into it. Little Deuce Coupe came out just 3 weeks after the Surfer Girl album. Even for those days, that was ridiculous. And why did this happen? Well, during the summer of '63, Capitol Records, the Beach Boys record company, had put out a compilation album including 2 Beach Boys songs, plus a number of other car-related songs, including one by Robert Mitchum. It was called Shut Down, and so they named it after the Beach Boys song. They put Shut Down on the record, they put 409 on the record, and the album was a big hit. It went to number 8 on the charts, and a lot of people bought it mistakenly thinking it was a Beach Boys record. And this made Brian, I guess, a little unhappy, understandably so. And he said, well, I want a piece of that action. So they basically decided to throw an album together around Little Deuce Coupe because Shut Down was already taken as an album title, even though they had already released Little Deuce Coupe not 3 weeks before on the Surfer Girl album. And so they basically reused 4 previously released Car songs, including the 2 that were on this Shutdown compilation, and they recorded 8 new tracks and put it out, and it worked. The thing was a smash hit. It was an even bigger hit than Surfer Girl, going to number 4 on the American charts and staying in the charts for 46 weeks. By this time, the Beach Boys were indeed the biggest band in America, which enjoy it while you can, lads, because there's some guys over in England warming up to make your life miserable. But for this brief period, fall of '63, the Beach Boys are on top. Another key thing occurs right before this album starts. The Beach Boys are on tour. Brian's not making most of the tours, which is making his father Murray unhappy. Al Jardine has been showing up for recording sessions. He's been taking Brian's place on tour. David Marks, kind of existing outside the family orbit, youngest member of the group, maybe some maturity issues and whatnot. He and Murray aren't getting along. So they're on the road driving somewhere the end of August, and a fight breaks out in the car, and Dave says, "I'm quitting." Murray seizes upon this and says, "Everyone hear that? Everyone hear that? Dave's quitting." So apparently the band did not really take this very seriously, but Dave did and Murray did. Very likely because Murray knew with Dave out of the band, Brian would have to return to the road because Al could no longer fill in for him, because Al would be the obvious replacement for David. And Murray wanted Brian back on the road, and he succeeded in getting Brian back on the road, which would have fateful consequences about a year later. But anyway, this occurs just a couple of days before the recording on Little Deuce Coupe is about to start. So that's the first thing that goes down. The second thing is that we are not entirely sure of the exact recording dates, but the paperwork was filed on September 2nd and the band of '63, and the band was not back from tour until August 31st. So there are some indications they may have done this whole thing the day they got back from tour over the course of 2 days. So they were in a hell of a hurry to bang this thing out, to get it out, and indeed it was out within a month from that time. So there really wasn't a very big window. They did this in 2 days, maybe. Unlike all of the other records that we've examined to date, there are no existing session recordings for us to go back and listen to and try and figure out exactly how these were tracked, who was on the tracks, whatnot. We can be fairly sure that it was confined to a small group of people because they just had to get this thing done in a hell of a hurry. But we can't be 100% sure of more than that. I want to explain a little bit about some of the working process of how I do this show, because it's relevant to some of the things we're going to talk about tonight. Craig Slowinski, who is one of the, if not the authorities on who played what on Beach Boys sessions throughout their career, has been extremely patient and generous in sharing his information with me to put out there to you. And he has a group of researchers that are young and enthusiastic who have done a lot of very intensive listening and giving him their input as to what they think is going on. And Alan Boyd, who's the Beach Boys official archivist and a very close friend of mine, has also been gracious enough to chime in here and there with some pretty important overview kind of things. These people know a lot more and are much more intimately involved with the band's history, the specifics of how things were recorded, and some of the minutiae of recording. I do know a lot of this stuff, but they know more than I do. However, I do have a great deal more experience than any of the people that have this expertise in one area, which is being in the studio as a producer and as a musician. So there are times when they'll tell me what they think is going on with some of these recordings, And most of the time I just go, yeah, that sounds about right. But once in a while, there will be a time when I go, yeah, I don't think they would have done that. And so that takes us down a fairly interesting road of kind of going back and forth where I'm giving them the perspective of the musician or the producer, and from them with a greater knowledge. So usually with the help of the session tapes, we can work everything out. With this one, we're all kind of guessing. And I drove Alan and Craig, I'm sure, quite insane with my nitpicking about some of the stuff that's on here. So I want to make clear that most of the stuff I'm going to tell you tonight is my opinion, but none of us really exactly knows what's happened with this record. When going through these tracks, Craig called my attention to the fact that one of the tracks, a song called Go Showboat, had an unusual mixdown. All of these songs were done on 3-track tape. So in other words, they had 3 discrete tracks that they can individually record elements on and individually mix. Capitol would generally do the stereo mix where the band is in the middle and the vocals hard right and left. However, on the Go Showboat track, it was different. There was what appeared to be 2 bands, the band playing once and the band playing again for a thicker sound, and the vocals summed in the middle. And this was one of these places where I said, yeah, this isn't what happened. Because if you've ever been in a band and you've had a song you're trying to learn and you've played it over the monitor speakers in your rehearsal space and you've tried to play with the track, you'll know that at some point your drummer is going to speed up or slow down, and you're going to find out you're on the chorus and the track's on the verse or something like that. It's almost impossible, if not completely impossible, to play in sync with a recording that's being played over a speaker. And remember, the band was not using headphones at this point. So I started digging into these tracks to figure out what really did happen, and what I discovered, in my opinion, is that they had overdubbed a snare drum onto this track. So I started to back engineer why they would have done that, and I got Alan and I argued a little bit in a friendly way about what we thought was going on, and Alan actually helped clarify my thinking on this. In the days before we had digital recording and Pro Tools and things like that, we would do what's called bouncing, and this is the exact same thing that the Beach Boys and other rock bands in the 50s and the 60s would do to get more instruments layered on their recordings. So, in the instance of a 3-track tape, like the Beach Boys had, let's say that you recorded part of the band on track 1, and then you had some overdubbed instruments on track 2. You could take those 2 elements, and if you so desired, perform live as you're playing them back. So you have a 3rd element, and put them all onto the 3rd track. And so now you've got the elements on track 1 and track 2 plus whatever you performed live, and it's all on 1 track. Now you've got 2 tracks left over, so you could, for instance, do 2 tracks of vocals on those remaining 2 tracks. The reason I'm telling you all this is the important thing to know about bouncing, and it's known to all of us that ever had to do this when we were kids, is whenever you did this bounce process, you're an analog. So you are going to lose fidelity on the prior instrumentation that you have re-recorded to the new track. So we call this generation. So the original recording is 1st generation. When you bounce it to another track, it's 2nd generation. When you bounce it again, it's 3rd and 4th and whatever. So each successive bounce that you do will decrease the fidelity and the clarity and the presence of the original thing that you did. It'll be blurrier sonically, it'll be mid-rangier, there won't be as much treble, there won't be as much punch. So when you hear stuff that's been bounced, what you'll tend to hear is the most recent element sounding, it'll sound in your mind like it's closer to you, it'll be brighter, it'll be clearer, it'll have more treble on it, and the earlier generations will kind of be blurry and more mid-rangey and in the back. This is why a lot of early rock and roll records, it's not the only reason, there's reasons of mastering and things like that, but this is why a lot of the early rock and roll records have that really cool kind of blurry, muddy sound, which is kind of cool, but they have it because of this bouncing process where they were trying to get more elements on the recording, and so the original track would get less and less distinct as they went on. There are 3 songs on this album where there are saxophones. This song, Be True to Your School, and Spirit of America, okay? So, according to Craig, the sax was tracked live with the band, and we believe the sax players were Steve Douglas and Jay Migliore from the Wrecking Crew and perhaps one other person, but we can't prove it. And that may indeed be the case, but it sounds to me more like you had a band track, like a basic band track, and then they overdubbed through this bouncing process the sax and the piano. The band, in other words, the drums, the bass, the guitars, they sound like a second generation, and the saxes and the piano sound like an overdub, one generation less. Now, whether this is the case or whether this is just a fluke of how they recorded it, I don't know. But what I do know is all these things wound up on one track, and after this process was completed on these songs, the band elements basically were receded way into the background, and the drums were basically lost. So what it sounded to me like on Go Showboat is they realized this, and they had Dennis go in and with the band playing back on the monitor, had him play a snare drum over it to bring the snare element back into the track. And so instead of having 2 bands, what you had was the monitor of the summed track of the band plus Dennis's first generation snare in the front. So that's all sounding like a snare drum in kind of the blurry band, which creates a stereo effect with the original band track, which is on the other track. And then they have all the vocals in the middle. So that is interesting because one of the things on this album that's very peculiar is there are, other than the recordings that were done previously, no Carl Wilson guitar solos on this album. There's one song that sounds like it might have guitar overdubs that are kind of a aggressive rhythm guitar, but there's no Carl leads. And usually Carl would overdub lead guitar either in the break in the vocal tracks or sometimes through this overdubbing method that I talked to you about earlier. So, and as I listened to these tracks, I thought I could tell several other songs where it seems like there's a very present snare and the band is basically in Bermuda somewhere, and it sounds again like the band track, the original basic track, got lost and Dennis had to overdub the snare, which seems to somehow have displaced Carl's guitar overdubbing in the whole process. Whatever they might have done to feature Carl in an overdub had to go out the window so that you could have the drums restored to the mix. So the end result of this is that you have a very guitar-light record relative to what we've heard before. To assemble all of these songs in such a hurry, Brian used a bunch of songs that he'd been working on with Roger Christian, a Los Angeles DJ who I referred to in the previous 2 episodes of this series as one of my favorite Beach Boys lyricists, making poetry basically out of jargon and technical information about cars. That was his thing. And at this time, Brian and Mike in particular were starting to think in terms of a commercial strategy to expand their audience because they were concerned that the surfing and beach culture would only be of interest to people on the coasts. And if they expanded their topical concerns to cars, they would have a better chance at reaching people in the heartland. And it seemed to work because this album did extremely well. And as I said, it set them up to be the biggest band in the country. It's the last album, almost until 2012, to feature David Marks as a member. And that sets us up to cover the 8 new songs that comprise Little Deuce Coupe. Okay, the first song on the album is Little Deuce Coupe. We covered it already. Brian did not do a 12-inch remix disco remake of the song. He just basically said, hey, here it is again. And here's the new album. So we'll move right on to Ballad of Ole Betsy, one of many songs in Roger Christian's repertoire where he equated cars to women, anthropomorphized them, She said, she gave her life to me. Drama much, Roger? Betsy took some beatings. Ugh, not so great. So I sung Roger Christian's praise as one of my favorite Beach Boys collaborators in previous episodes. I have to say that listening to this album, which I wasn't super familiar with, I've revised my opinion a little bit. I may have oversold Roger a little, although he has one great moment later on the record. But as far as the music goes, I want to get the guitar out because this song really struck me despite the general goofiness of the concept and the sappiness of how Brian's singing all sentimental about this car, this little piece of crap. The music is really quite sophisticated. The intro starts out, it's similar to the verse, but it's a different chord progression. She was born in 32, no one gives a crap. And so standard doo-wop progression, right? Goes again. Then we get to this point, and then we're down a half step to set up a switch to F minor to A flat 7. Very cool change. Then down to minor, then down a half step, back to F minor, then B flat minor, then da 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 da. So that's a pretty sophisticated chain of chord progressions. So that repeats twice. Then we go, Betsy was a lady. So to the dominant 7, da 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 da. So you've got a completely different bit for the C section, or D section, I guess. And then at the end, you have an outro that is quite complex harmonically. It's an a cappella breakdown that's a takeoff on the arrangement of Graduation Day, which is something that they did, were already probably doing in concert. So they were already repurposing something for this album because they had to get it out super fast. One other really odd thing about the Ballad of Ole Betsy is if you listen to the bulk of the song, not the breakdown at the end, but the rest of it, whoever's singing the high part behind Brian's lead vocal sounds very peculiar, almost like a woman. Craig's team believes this is just Al Jardine just singing really high. Craig wondered if it wasn't, it sounded a little bit like Marilyn. I'm going to go out on a limb and say I believe this was Audrey, the Wilson brothers' mom. And if you will go back to the last, the bonus episode we did, 3A, where we played the Kenny and the Cadets song and you could hear Audrey's voice real well. Yeah, to me, this is the same voice, and it makes a lot of sense because they weren't going to have a lot of time to cast around for outside singers. If they had a part that nobody could hit, Mom was probably right in the control room. Mom, come in, we need you here. So I believe Audrey is singing the top part in the background, except at the end, which is the band. And actually, you can really hear, because the band sings in legato and they come apart a little bit. You can really hear all the individual parts quite well at the sort of Graduation Day ending. And you can also hear a couple of timing errors because there are places where the track slows down and whatnot. At 1 minute and 27 seconds, you can hear Dennis kind of scoop up to his note because he's late. He's like, oh, we're starting now. So that's kind of cool. The vocals are very, very loud to the track, which is interesting. But Brian does a wonderful job with a pretty dodgy lyric. It's a beautiful little falsetto performance by him. So very interesting song. And like I said, I believe Audrey features on this track. Next one is Be True to Your School, the album version. Now, we're also going to talk about the single version, which was recorded sometime after these sessions. Nobody really knows exactly when. The single version of this went to number 6. There's less complicated instrumentation on the Little Deuce Coupe album version. To my ear, it's a tighter track. The single version, I mean, it has the Honeys, the band that included Brian's future wife, Marilyn, and that he was producing outside of the group. It has them on sort of cheerleader backing vocals, and that's the highlight of the single version. And the single version is also a bit faster, has a little more energy to it, but it's just a sloppy track. The single version has a lot of outside elements. It's probably the first time they really went for it in terms of bringing in session players, because they have what's believed to be 3 extra drummers besides Dennis playing stupid, as only Dennis can, dunk, 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 and you've got someone, probably Hal, going and someone else doing a crashing cymbal. So then you got, I guess, piccolos or some kind of woodwind instrument, basically suggesting a high school band. You've got all these crazy elements going bah on the single version. And it's cool, but it's a mess if you listen to it. The album version is a bit tighter, but it does seem to be like the Go Showboat I referred to earlier. It does sound like the snare drum may have been overdubbed on this, and you can hear the very present sax that you hear on the other tracks where this is the case. I have to ask if this was really considered cool in the 60s. School spirit, woo! I mean, I went to high school in the 80s. I know this would have been a big frickin' joke to us. I don't know how it was in the 60s. It was a more innocent time. Maybe it was really, really cool. But I must observe, this is not a song about cars. There's nothing to do about cars. Why it's on this album, I don't know. By the way, who co-wrote this? Who let the dogs out? Wait a minute. Okay. It's a Mike Love. Mike Love apparently wrote the lyrics to this. However, this is one of his retroactive 1994 crediting, so maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I think he probably did. Craig's team believe that Brian and Al are doubling on the high vocal part. By the way, it's assumed that for the tracking on these songs, and it's really hard to hear most of them for the reasons I already stated, but it's Dennis on drums, Dave and Carl on guitar, Al Jardine on bass, Brian on piano. There may be some instance on this record where there's no piano and Brian's on bass, but I didn't notice one. So, Brian may be on bass somewhere, I don't know. But anyway, as I was saying about Brian and Al doubling on the top vocal part, and I'm not sure if that's true on the album version, but it might be true on the single version. I didn't listen that closely, to be honest. But I did hear in the album version, one of those guys, you can hear at 1 minute and 37 seconds, the top voice starts getting a little bit rough, and then the voice cracks, and then the falsetto cracks, drops out completely, comes back in singing in full voice instead of falsetto, because we're starting to get Al being very prevalent in the backup vocals. I want to talk a little bit about how difficult his job was. Because when I've sung in Beach Boys tribute bands, in general, my job was usually to sing Al's part, which is the tenor harmony underneath Brian. So he's usually singing the part that Dennis had sung in the first album, that Carl had intermittently sung after that. And that's a tough range because you're always up here. Al's gig, which is up to be singing that register and singing up there all the time, very difficult. And you can definitely hear it on Be True to Your School, if that's him, and I think it is, where he just kind of falls apart there. And no disrespect to Al, because I've sung that part. It's a tough part. Okay, next track, Car Crazy Cutie. This track has an interesting history. It was originally a song called Pamela Jean that Brian had recorded with one of his outside productions, which we'll probably be covering on this month's bonus episode. And it was a band called The Survivors. The music is definitely inspired by Dion and the Belmonts, a band that Dennis at least was very fond of. And it's really cool to hear the Beach Boys take, where you hear Mike come in and then Dennis come in, a little out of tune in the first run, and then Carl, and you can just hear Dennis's enthusiasm when he comes in for this material. This is the third straight song with sort of a shaky rhythmic breakdown. We had that in Be True to Your School as well, where there was a rhythmic hiccup. Brian's melody is sort of in Mike's wheelhouse in terms of the kind of swag that he puts into it, but you can see why Mike didn't do it, because the melody's pretty acrobatic. He's all over the place. It's a pretty impressive performance. More car is girl metaphors. I just have to point out that Candy Apple Lips, which is a peculiar lyric to say the least, it's also awfully close sonically to Candy Ass Lips. I don't know if that was deliberate. It's a fairly straight ahead doo-wop progression, not as adventurous as the chord progressions in the prior two songs, although it has a few ringer chords. Ringer is a term we musicians use when there's an unexpected chord in an otherwise fairly straightforward chord progression. So there's a couple of ringer chords in the bridge. The outro falsetto is very close melodically to the song that would come later on the Beach Boys Today album, She Knows Me Too Well. Now, the Survivors session where they cut Pamela Jean was only a very short time before this session. I think Brian did it while the rest of the band were on the road. And then, Brian had to throw this song together, and he basically said, well, we're doing it with new lyrics, and the Survivors got a little pissed about that, not surprisingly, and Brian said, well, it's my music, so you can totally dig that. The Survivors version did eventually get released as a single. It went basically nowhere. This is another song where I think there's a possibility the snare drum was overdubbed, but this one doesn't have sax on it, so if it was, then there was some other reason why that was done, other than the one I theorized about at the beginning of the show. Oh, one more thing on Car Crazy Cutie. Listen at 2 minutes and 31 seconds in one of the channels, someone just suddenly goes, doo-doo-doo, and it's loud. I don't know if that was left over from a prior take or someone was screwing around, because it goes right back to what it was doing after that. It's doo-doo-doo. So check out for the doo-doo-doo. Next song, Cherry Cherry Coupe, otherwise known as Land Ahoy, which we covered in the Surfin' Safari debut episode of this series. Brian, never one to waste a good idea, repurposed that song for this album. You get the feeling they did this in a hurry? Maybe. So we have lyrics for this by Roger Christian, just like all the other ones pretty much. What's interesting about this is the sort of da 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 kind of dumb melody. They were doing that in Surfin' Safari days. It's not really cool anymore. This is more. It sounds more like a Janet Dean record than that kind of simplistic melody. Now it seems very dated. But I want to point out in this song you start to hear something that I think makes the Beach Boys recordings in the 60s, especially their car recordings, so compelling, and that they're starting to dial in the sonics of recording the vocals and how they're using the reverb and even the sort of the cloud created by the bouncing and the mono summing of the tracks. And the vocals start to have kind of a car-like quality. They almost sound like an engine going vroom. They just cohere in such a nice way. It's a very pleasing song, even though it's dumb as hell. Now, one thing, there's a line in there about the car doors not opening and Mike Love opening them with a solid A system, which is, I guess, supposed to be solenoid. And I've never really understood how this mechanical system was going to enable his car door to open by itself. And so I did go to Wikipedia to try and research the solenoid or Cellude system, and the diagrams on the Wikipedia page basically terrified me. So that's not happening. There may be no Al on this song vocally, but one thing that's interesting is this is perhaps the only one of the new tracks where you really hear the guitar up front and center. And I'm wondering to myself if there wasn't a guitar overdub along with perhaps, again, a snare drum overdub, because if you listen to the rest of the band, they're out in Peoria. But you hear the guitars, and the rhythm guitar is really pushing. I'm wondering if that wasn't Dave kind of like in a hurry to get out of the band, because it's almost like proto-funk, the way that he's playing the rhythm guitar, and he's pretty ahead of the beat. It's a little more than the usual pushing the downstroke. It's like, yeah, I got to go to the bathroom or something. So that's kind of interesting. I don't know if that was Dave or Carl, but it stands out. Next we got Shut Down, and for this, Brian prepared a special 12-inch disco remix. Actually, he did not, so we'll skip to Spirit of America, another pretty simplistic doo-wop, kind of a progression. This song was a tribute to the recent record-breaking car speed achievement by a driver named Craig Breedlove at a place called Bonneville, Utah, where I have actually been, and it's also the subject of my favorite DB's song, Bonneville. Shout out there to Pete Holsapple. Another peculiar lyric performance by Roger Christian. Never end a line with averaged. Craig Breedlove had averaged 407 per hour. Yeah, I'm starting to regret all the Roger Christian praise singing I did. I mean, Shut Down is a brilliant lyric, but this one, this turned up in my research somewhere, I don't remember where. But Roger Christian had a tendency to give Jan Berry of Jan and Dean, with whom he also was working, basically the same song. It was the same concepts, a different set of lyrics, but the same storyline, same concept. So apparently Jan and Dean did a song called Ballad of Bonneville, which is, again, celebrating Craig Breedlove's Land Speed record. Some more peculiarities on this track. One is that this does also sound like a snare overdub, but there's a little bit of evidence against that, and then I also pretty clearly hear a bass drum on this. Now, on all the other songs where I theorize there was an overdub, I only really hear the snare, and technically that would have been much easier to do than miking up the whole drum kit and overdubbing that again. Plus, it's once you've done that, it's a lot harder to sync up to a track, especially if you're playing through a monitor. If you're just playing a snare, it's pretty easy to keep track of where the song is. But if you're playing a whole kit, again, to a monitor, that's tough. So not only is there bass drum and snare on this, but it's a pretty tight performance. So if it was overdubbed, kudos to Dennis for doing a really good job on this. Also, the vocals are very peculiar on this. First of all, in one of the channels, Al, at least we believe it's Al, he's extremely loud. And this may be a holdover from something that we think might have happened in the next song. Again, No Go Showboat. But also, Dennis is not on this track vocally as far as I can tell. If he is, he's completely inaudible. So you just hear super loud Al, real quiet Carl, and Mike down in the bottom going doo-doo-doo-doo. So why Dennis left, it may had to go surfing, maybe his voice gave out. Maybe he is there, but we don't hear him, but that would be unusual because Dennis tended to be the second loudest singer on Mike after Brian. Carl being audible, Dennis not being audible, that's kind of not a thing. So it doesn't seem like Dennis is on this track. Okay, No Go Showboat. I'm kind of glad that I covered all that stuff in the beginning because otherwise No Go Showboat probably would have taken a half an hour. First of all, this is Al's first lead vocal, sort of, because you hear him where it shifts to minor. You know, I'm really out of luck. I'm even shot down by the ice cream truck. That's Al. But what's peculiar is he's only single tracked. All of the other lead vocals and all of the other backing vocals are double tracked. Why is Al, and he's also quite loud in these parts. He's louder than Mike and Brian's lead vocals. So I went down, quite far down a rabbit hole and got into it with both Craig and Alan on my theories, and I've kind of reached sort of a compromise place in what they were telling me what I think. But what I think happened, why this occurred, is the place where Al sings lead. The lyrics are tongue twisters. It really rates fine in the custom clan with hand-formed panels, tuck and roll rear pan. Like, I could barely just say that, and I had it written right in front of me. So what I suspect happened is Brian had planned to have the backing vocalists carry that section. And when they completed the lyrics, which by the way are hilarious, these are the best Roger Christian lyrics on the album, although the lead singer of, I think he's the lead singer of The Survivors, the band I referred to earlier, Rich Peterson, aka Alarian, apparently claims he wrote the words to this and also Custom Machine. If so, then Roger, I have to retract my credit, but these are the best lyrics on the album on this one. They're very realistic and quite funny. But I believe that on this whole sort of tongue-twisting chorus, that when the band sang it, it came out sounding something like blah, 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 because that's what I would expect. These are difficult lyrics to sing. The guys are in a hell of a hurry. So they probably did the track, they did first pass or maybe both passes, and when it got to that point, it's okay if it's just backup vocalists, but the backup vocalists are the lead there, and they're dropping the ball. So I think that's when, after the first pass of the vocals, or possibly both passes of the vocals, Brian decided to feature Al, who was singing the top part of the harmony, to articulate the words on that section. Now, where the controversy came in is how this was done. It happened one of two ways. Either it occurred on the second vocal pass. In other words, the band does all of its vocals together. And then Brian spots this problem and says, this ain't working out. We need you to, step up to the mic and really sing this thing. Or it came up after they'd done both tracks, in which case they would have had a problem because they already know probably that they've got to do the snare. Craig and the team, they didn't really dig the idea that they would have done all the vocals and then Al would have done another vocal on top of that, because that creates a technical issue for Brian. I think what happened though is that either they did both the vocals and double tracked the whole thing, and then Al sort of did this on top of it, which would explain why his vocal sticks out like a sore thumb relative to everything else. Or possibly Al, on the second pass, went over to Mike's microphone, and him being a louder singer than Mike would account for the difference in levels. And it may be that he was able to sort of sing his part, depending on what it was, and I'm a little unsure about that too. He might have been able to sort of fine-tune his performance on the louder mic so that it didn't stick out like a sore thumb, and then we stepped up to do his vocals in his louder lead voice. You got it jumping out at you like that. But a very peculiar thing with the Al vocal, and again makes me wonder if the Spirit of America vocal wasn't done right after that, because we have Al sticking out like a sore thumb there on the first track of that one as well. Anyway, the thought that had just occurred to me is I wondered if the reason they didn't do this peculiar arrangement of the tracks that resulted in the vocals being in mono had something to do with the possibility that they had overdubbed Al on top of the previous double track stack, because I had thought it was just to leave room for the snare drum overdub, but if they're overdubbing the snare throughout the album, that's not the reason. So something for all you Beach Boys scholars out there to consider. The rest of you don't give a crap, I know that. So anyway, first Al lead vocal, and possibly first Mike Love falsetto performance. Yes, you heard it here first. Listen to the track at 1 minute and 57 seconds. Some falsetto comes out of nowhere sounding like a cracked old woman. It's the exact same voice we hear Mike using later in Cassius Love versus Sonny Wilson to imitate and make fun of Brian's falsetto. It may be Mike at the end chiming in on extra falsetto, doing a deliberately bad performance. Listen to it all the way out to the ending. There's a little dueling falsetto thing between Brian and whoever this clown is. So listen for that. But yeah, hilarious lyrics. Well, the engine compartment's filled with all chrome goodies. Yeah, but everyone takes me, even old Ford Woodies. When it comes to speed, man, I'm just out of luck. I'm even shut down by the ice cream truck. Now, most people don't know, but this song was covered by Petula Clark in French. Believe it or not, it's called J'ai pas le temps. I don't have the time. She apparently had been doing French recordings as well as English recordings as far back as the early 50s. She does sound very British on her French, but she did indeed cover a Beach Boys tune. I wonder whose idea that was. Okay, A Young Man Is Gone. Quite obviously a retooling of Their Hearts Were Full of Spring, with lyrics to reflect the recent, at that time, beefing of James Dean, who died in a car crash. It was sort of akin at the time to the same kind of cultural impact as Kurt Cobain's death in the 90s. For those of you that are young enough to wonder who that is, I don't have a modern day equivalent for you. But anyway, it was a big deal. He was an actor. A lot of kids liked him. And so they rewrote the lyrics. Mike apparently did it to, again, retool a song they already had in their repertoire to fill out this record. And it was a very impressive 4-part a cappella. Now, what's interesting about this is you can start to hear how Al really sharpened up their vocal sound. Dennis, while he has a very compelling vocal style, and it can really make the difference in a lot of these vocal tracks. He's sort of rough, sandpapered tonality. He's not the precision singer Al is, and his voice doesn't cut, to use Carl's words, like Al's does. So if you listen to their version of Hearts Were Full of Spring, which you can find on the Hype Morgan demos that they did in 1961-62, they do it in a lower key, and Dennis does just fine on it, but it's mushier. It's a little mush. It's not quite as tight of a performance. They raise the key for Al, and yeah, now you're starting to hear that, again, that almost automotive blend that the Beach Boys have once they've got Al in the band. Dennis not on this as far as we can tell, but Dennis will also continue to contribute important things vocally to the band's harmonic blend from here on out. Now that they've got Al and Dennis, they got Al who's really cutting, and you got Dennis who's got that thing, and you just have this really thick, full blend. Now we're going to get the really great harmony vocals. Next song, Custom Machine. Speaking of Dennis's vocal character, you can really hear him prominently near the top of the harmony stack. Particularly on one channel, you can really hear him. You can hear his sort of great vocal approach when he kind of goes and drops down into the chorus. You could just hear how much he contributed to the band on the vocals of this track. I think the only song on this album that has an overdubbed instrumental break, probably on the vocal track, and it is performed by Brian. So again, no Carl guitar solo. Mike is credited on this song. I'm a little skeptical of this credit. The automotive jargon doesn't sound as much in his wheelhouse as some of the other people that we've got. And in fact, yes, Rich Peterson from the Survivors claims he wrote the lyrics on this, and in this case, I tend to agree with him. And if he's telling the truth on this one, he's probably telling the truth on No Go Showboat, which means I can't give Roger Christian any brownie points for the lyrics in this album. Sometimes you're just wrong. You put yourself out there and you say, Roger Christian, great lyricist, and really he wrote a great lyric. So no disrespect to Roger, who was a cool guy, and I met his daughter once, a long time ago. Or maybe it was his son, I don't remember. It's a long time ago. We all lose our memories as we get older, but one of my favorite memories is I was with the Wondermints at the legendary Brian Wilson tribute concert where they first hooked up with Brian. I was actually playing with the band, and this was one of the songs they chose to do, and I got to do something on it. I can't remember what I played on it or sang, but I did something. It's a really interesting, slightly dissonant chorus on it. We all believe that there's 5 parts there, although I didn't check. They also kind of do the Jan and Dean ending that they did on a bunch of different songs. Ooh, ooh, except someone's going wow. And this reminds me of a funny story I heard from Al, actually, when they were doing the EPK for the Pet Sounds, I think Pet Sounds box set, and they were interviewing Al, and they took questions from the audience, and I asked him about the difficulty of reproducing the Pet Sounds song live, and the recollection that he chose to share was that often he and Carl couldn't agree on the consonant sounds they were going to sing on, and I think he referenced, wouldn't it be nice? I don't remember, like someone was doing ooh and someone else was doing woo. And he said, well, I just sang my way and Carl sang his way and it worked out. I don't know if that made it onto the DVD or not, but that seems to be what's going on here, because someone's going wahoo, and it sounds like Carl. He's just like, I'm doing wahoo, guys. There's a really cool bass line buried back in this track. Whoever did it, probably Al. Nice work. So that pretty much covers the Little Deuce Coupe album in excruciating detail. So again, I want to encourage you to subscribe to the Karma Frog channel. You'll see a Karma Frog logo in one of these corners. Click on that and subscribe to this. Consider becoming a patron at any level to see the bonus content we're starting to put up every month on this channel. There's information about that in the info box or in the first comment down below. I'm Adam Marsland, and stay tuned. We'll be back where we've promised to have a lot of new and interesting information for the Beach Boys' next album, Shut Down Volume 2.